Good afternoon. My name is Farah Kiladar and I'm the CEO of the World Affairs Council. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's wonderful to see people interacting and having conversations. That's the whole idea of these programs. I would like to thank Alan Livingston, who unfortunately for health reasons hasn't been able to join us, as well as Paul Asofsky for assisting us with hosting the speaker. Gershon Baskin was the initiator and the person responsible for the secret back-channel talks between Israel and Hamas that eventually succeeded in the release of the abducted soldier Gilad Shalit. Dr. Baskin was the Israel co-director and founder of the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information. It's a joint Israeli-Palestinian think tank and do tank located in Jerusalem, and more recently, since 2012, he has been the chairman of the board. Previously, Dr. Baskin was the executive director of the Institute of Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence. During the premiership of the late Yitzhak Rabin, Gershon served as advisor on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to a secret team of peace officers. Dr. Baskin has a regular column in the Jerusalem Post newspaper and was radio host on All for Peace Radio. He's been awarded several prizes, and his memoir, The Negotiator, Freeing Gilad Shalit from Hamas, was published in 2013. If any of you are interested in purchasing that memoir, you can get a 20% discount and can speak to one of our staff members up front. Please join me today in welcoming our speaker. Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the lunch and the company that I had the occasion to bring you together for. Today is Israel Independence Day, marking 67 years of the existence of the State of Israel. For me as an Israeli, this is a day of celebration. I think that we have a lot to be proud of. And the State of Israel is quite an amazing place with an enormous amount of achievements and a great deal of problems. About 10 years ago, on Independence Day, I received a phone call in the morning from a Palestinian high school principal that I was working with. And he said to me, "Happy holiday." For the first time in my life, I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say. Here's a Palestinian who, for him, Israel's Independence Day is Nakba Day, the day of the tragedy, the catastrophe that led between 800 and 900,000 Palestinians to be refugees from their homes. And he's calling me on Israel Independence Day to wish me a happy holiday. When I closed the phone, I said, I know what I should have said. I should have said, in Hebrew we say, B'korov etzlacha. Hopefully soon, you too will celebrate your Independence Day. So on the rare occasion that a Palestinian wishes me happy Independence Day, I now know what to say. Yesterday was our Memorial Day. Israel, I don't know if you know this, has a very bizarre tradition. We go from the deepest day of mourning, 28,000 plus Israelis who have been killed in battle for the existence of the State of Israel. Every family, every person deeply affected directly from the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors. We go from a day of national mourning where people visit the military cemeteries all day long. On the radio stations, on television, we hear stories of the brave fallen soldiers. And then after sundown, after a brief interlude of quiet, we emerge in a massive celebration of our independence, going from this deep, dark mourning to a very lofty celebration. It's one of the most unusual experiences, I think, that exist in any country. Last evening, 2 evenings ago, on the eve of Memorial Day, for the 9th year running, 2 organizations of Israelis and Palestinians convened a joint Memorial Day ceremony in Tel Aviv. The Bereaved Family Forum, which represents Israelis and Palestinians whose closest loved ones have been killed in the conflict, came together, formed an organization whose slogan is, "We don't want any more members." This is an organization that I admire more than any other organization in the world and hope never to be a member of. People who have lost their closest loved ones in this conflict, on both sides of the conflict, have come together, mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters, and said, no more. We don't want revenge. We don't want the next generation of killing, of death, of terrorism, of suicides. We want this to end. And the other organization, another brave organization called Combatants for Peace, are former Israeli soldiers and officers and Palestinian combatants from the various Palestinian fighting forces, Fatah and other groups, who also come together and said, we're laying down our arms and we refuse to kill each other anymore. This conflict is resolvable and we refuse to take part in sustaining it. These 2 organizations came together 9 years ago and started doing a ceremony in Tel Aviv on the eve of Memorial Day, which is very courageous, very emotional. In my mind, it is the most important day of the year. While the whole country in Israel is mourning their death, a group of Israelis and Palestinians are coming together. There were about 3,000 of them this year who came together. It was live streamed and broadcast on the internet, of people who can mourn together. The normal Palestinian reaction to this is, how could you go there with those people who killed us? Likewise, the Israeli reaction is, how can you celebrate with these terrorists who killed our soldiers on our Memorial Day? And this, in my mind, is the most compelling ceremony that exists in a conflict anywhere, of people who have paid the price more than anyone else and don't want to continue paying the price. I say this as an opening because when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're talking about life and death issues. This is not simple. This is not holding hands around a campfire and singing songs and being nice to each other. The decisions that our leaders make on both sides of the conflict have consequences directly on the lives of everyone who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And it is so important that we understand what's going on there and what's at stake there and what are the possibilities and what are the risks, that we understand how to do this, because we failed until now. I want to start with a few basics. What is this conflict about? In my mind, in my understanding, this is a conflict between 2 national movements over what I call a territorial expression of identity. The Jewish people, organized in their national liberation movement called the Zionist movement, have been willing to fight and to die and to kill for more than 100 years so that the Jewish people can have a piece of land they call their own, on which they express their identity, their culture, their religion, their heritage, and control their own destiny with self-determination. And the Palestinian people and the Palestinian national movement have been willing to fight, to die, and to kill for more than 100 years so that they too can have a territorial expression of their identity, a land that they can call their own, where they are masters of their destiny and they can express themselves through their own self-determination. This is what it's about. Neither side is willing to be ruled over by the other side, nor is either side interested in creating the United States of Israel-Palestine, where they would have some kind of homogenized identity. And if this is true, what I'm saying, that this is what this conflict is about, then there is only one solution for this conflict. And it's a solution that was proposed first in 1937 by the Peel Commission, and once again on November 20, 9th, 1947 by the United Nations General Assembly in its UN Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. And that is dividing the land between the river and the sea into two states for two people. There is no other solution to this conflict if it is in fact a conflict of two national movements over a territorial expression of identity. There is no such thing as a one-state solution if solution means end of conflict, because neither side will end up with their expression of their identity in control of that territory. The idea of a one-state solution is nice. It fits into American political realities. The dream that one person, one vote would rule the land between the river and the sea made up of two peoples or more is a very lofty, nice idea. The problem is it doesn't answer the cause of the conflict, of what these two people have been willing to fight, to die, and to kill for. Today, we have a one-state reality with two unequal people. We have one people in charge and another people who are occupied. That is the reality on the ground. And that reality is not sustainable. And in that reality, we have continued conflict. I want to tell you a few personal stories of how I came to my understanding of where I am today and what needs to be done. I grew up in New York in a very Jewish neighborhood. In fact, the elementary school that I went to was so Jewish, I had one non-Jewish friend. He was the luckiest kid in school because he got invited to everyone's bar mitzvah. Being Jewish for me was not an expression of religion. We were a secular family. We belonged to a synagogue because that's what you did. It was more social than anything else. Of course, we went to the synagogue on Jewish holidays, but I didn't really believe in the liturgy or what they taught me in Hebrew school. It was more because that's what we did, that's where you grew up. I got very involved politically at the end of the 1960s, growing up in that generation of action and activity, and got involved in the civil rights movement from the age of 11 or 12 in the anti-Vietnam War movement. My local congressman was well known and respected for being one of the leaders of the anti-war movement, Allard Lowenstein. His son, by the way, is the chief of staff of Kerry today, of John Kerry. At the age of 14, my family moved to another town, where in my high school there were 3,200 students and only 2 or 3% Jews. And in my first week in school, a young Jewish guy approached me and said, I just spent the summer in Israel and we're starting a chapter of Young Judea in our town. Young Judea is a Zionist youth movement. Well, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what Zionism was. I didn't know what a Zionist youth movement was, but I thought it might be a good place to meet Jewish girls. So I joined, and I liked it, not only because of the Jewish girls, but because it was serious. And we were a group of young people who took ourselves very seriously, and it was intellectual and challenging and stimulating, and I got very involved in the Zionist youth movement. And by the time I was in my senior year of high school, I was elected to be the president of the Long Island region of the Zionist youth movement, and I spent the following year in Israel on the Zionist youth movement study program. And I lived half a year on a kibbutz up north and half a year in Jerusalem studying. And I would travel back and forth between Jerusalem and the kibbutz through the Jordan Valley, going through the West Bank. It was an invisible line that separated the West Bank and the rest of Israel. When I got home that summer after this very intensive year of study and fun, traveling throughout Israel, I had a map. I was working in the Zionist movement summer camp, and I had a map of Israel next to my bed with little pins in all the places that I had visited. And I came back to my room one day, and someone drew in the green line on my map. Y'all know what the green line is? The green line is the armistice line of the 1949 armistice agreement between Israel and Jordan, where the territory to the east of the green line was occupied by Jordan, and the territory to the west of the green line was Israel. This was not a permanent border, it was an armistice line. Anyway, World Affairs Council, here's a trivia question. Anyone know why it's called a green line? It's not too tricky. It's not a trick question. They used a green pen. And since 1949, a green line on an international map indicates an armistice line. not a permanent border, which on international maps are indicated with either blue lines or red lines. But a green line on a map indicates an armistice line. One more trivia question. Anyone else know where there's another green line in the world today?
Korea.
No, it's a DMZ. It's not the same as an armistice line, although it sort of is, but it's not. Cyprus. Cyprus has a green line between the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus and the Republic of Cyprus in the south. Anyway, moving on. So I had this green line drawn on my map, and all of a sudden I'm looking at the map thinking of how I'm going to get between the kibbutz and Jerusalem, going through the Palestinian West Bank. And it suddenly dawned on me that I spent this year, intensive study in Israel, in a place that I already decided is going to be my home. I decided when I was 16 that I was going to move to Israel. And I knew no Arabs. Spent a year there, didn't talk to anyone. Went to the old city of Jerusalem market and bought stuff, but I never sat down to have a conversation with anyone. And I realized this place that I was going to be calling home, I have this huge gap in my education and in my knowledge. And I went out and read everything I could get my hands on. I read about 100 books in the first year about the Israeli-Arab conflict and what it means to be an Arab in Israel and the Palestinians. Started learning Arabic a little bit. And in 1976, when I was living in New York City with a group of fellow compatriots who were planning to move to Israel together, we decided, hey, why don't we pick up the phone and call the PLO office in New York? They have a representative office to the United Nations. The Palestine Liberation Organization was an organization recognized by the UN as an observer organization of the Palestinian people. And we picked up the phone and called the ambassador, who was an old, astute diplomat gentleman from East Jerusalem, an exile from his own city, and asked if he would meet with us, a group of 3 Zionist students living in New York City. And he said yes. He agreed to meet us after work hours and took us into the office through a back door. And we sat with him with the goal of trying to convince him to recognize the state of Israel and agree to a 2-state solution, 1976. Well, his response to us was anything but diplomatic. He said, "Over my dead body. We will never recognize Israel. Israel has no right to exist. You took our land, and you Jews should go back to where you came from." Well, I was disappointed, but not despairing, because in my own mind, I believed that the Palestinians would eventually have to come to terms with the reality of Israel. It was not something that was going to disappear, nor would they have the ability to erase it from the map. And in planning my aliyah, my immigration to Israel, I thought, well, what can I do? I really wanted to be involved in political cross-boundary work of working between Israelis and Palestinians, but there didn't seem to be an opportunity to do that. And I heard about a reform rabbi who was organizing young Jewish university graduates to go and live in Arab villages in Israel and work on programs of democracy and coexistence. I don't know if you know this, but at that time, 18% of Israel's citizens were Palestinian Arabs who stayed in Israel. They didn't become refugees. They were in Israel when Israel was born, and they became citizens of the state of Israel. Today, it's 21% of the population of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And while Israel is a democracy, there is discrimination against them, both institutional, structural discrimination and social discrimination. And it's a problem. It's a problem for a country which says that it's a democracy. And I thought this was a great opportunity for me to go and learn and live in an Arab village and meet people and begin to learn Arabic and learn what's going on for reality. And I would wait until the time emerged when I could actually work on Israeli-Palestinian cross-boundary issues. So I went and lived in the village. When I was there, I had a visit from people in Los Angeles who talked about working in the county of Los Angeles in inter-ethnic group relations in the county of Los Angeles. And it made me wonder how many people are working in the state of Israel, employed by the state of Israel as civil servants, working on improving the relations between Jewish and Arab citizens of the state of Israel. I did a little piece of research. It wasn't very difficult because the answer was 0. And I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, Mr. Menachem Begin, and I said, here I am. Hire me. It took me 14 months of lobbying, and I became the first civil servant in Israel responsible for Jewish-Arab relations. I helped to create the Department for Education for Democracy and Coexistence in the Ministry of Education, and the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence, which was funded by the German government through the Prime Minister's office in the Ministry of Education. And I directed that for 7 years. Then one morning, on December 9th, 1987, there was an automobile accident between an Israeli army vehicle and a truck, a van carrying Palestinian workers from the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, the largest refugee camp in Gaza, and 4 of those Palestinian workers were killed. Rumors spread across the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza that it wasn't an accident. It was an intentional murder of the Israeli army of these Palestinian workers, and riots erupted in Jabalia refugee camp and spread within hours across the entire Gaza Strip and within days across to the West Bank, throughout the West Bank. And something new was born called Intifada. We never heard the word before. Most Palestinians never heard the word before. It comes from the Arabic root nafada, which means to shake up. And if you can envision taking an old dusty rug and shaking it, and all the dust flies upward, that's nafada. And the idea of Intifada was after 20 years of Israeli control, after those territories were occupied by Israel in its war in 1967, the people said, no more. We don't want to live under Israeli rule anymore. We want freedom and independence. And they rose up against the Israeli control. They didn't have weapons. Women and youth and hundreds of thousands of people across the territories confronted the Israeli army in this Intifada. For 20 years, Israel ruled these territories and controlled millions of Palestinians with less than 1 division of the Israeli army, and overnight, on December 9th, 1987, it changed. The leadership of the Palestinians, the local leadership, not the PLO that was in distant Tunisia at this time, but the local leadership in the refugee camps understood that something revolutionary was happening. And they organized themselves very quickly into something they called the United Command of the Intifada, which represented the 4 main political groups that made up the PLO: the Fatah Party of Yasser Arafat, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Palestinian Communist Party. And they created this unified leadership, and they began issuing leaflets to the public of directives of where to hold demonstrations and strike days and days of rage and activities of this kind or another. And they started to integrate into these leaflets. We didn't have email and faxes in those days and SMSs and smartphones. It was all paper being distributed around the refugee camps, cities and towns of the West Bank and Gaza. And they started integrating into these texts political messages. And the political messages that we're writing, as I was reading them, I was stunned. They didn't talk about what the PLO ambassador told me over my dead body: go away, you have no right to be here. What they said is, our goal is to end the occupation of the lands that Israel occupied in 1967, to create an independent Palestinian state next to Israel and not in place of Israel. In the first Shabbat morning of March in 1988, in order to hear firsthand if what I was reading was true and reflected what people were saying, I got onto my little Vespa motorcycle living in Jerusalem and drove to the Dheisheh refugee camp south of Bethlehem, the largest refugee camp in the West Bank. And I drove into the refugee camp, and at the entrance of the camp there's a United Nations school. And I took off my helmet, and I was immediately approached by some people my age. I was in my 20s. And they said to me, who are you and what are you doing here? And I said to them in my broken Arabic, I'm an Israeli and I came to listen. I want to know what it is you're fighting for. What is this Intifada about? We stood in the parking lot for about 20 minutes talking, and then someone said, Yalla, come with me to my house. And I walked into the refugee camp, and about 30 people crammed into this tiny little house in the Dheisheh refugee camp. And I spent 6 hours there that Saturday morning. Not once did someone tell me what the PLO ambassador told me. In fact, the message was quite the opposite. I went home buzzing with energy and optimism, with a sense that that moment that I was hoping for back in 1976 had arrived. I wrote a letter of resignation to the Ministry of Education and Prime Minister's office from the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence. I wrote a little advertisement and went down to East Jerusalem and published it in 3 Palestinian daily newspapers. I wrote, if you believe in the 2-state solution, if you believe that Palestinians and Israelis can work together for peace, call me. The ad went in on a Friday morning. I received 43 phone calls by Saturday night. I made appointments with anyone who was willing to talk to me, I took a table in the courtyard of the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem and sat there for 5 days and met with 23 people. In preparation for these discussions, I wrote a 1.5-page paper in which I said the following. The Intifada changed the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from an existential conflict of us or you into a conflict over issues of us and you, and the question is how. And I proposed that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was about 7 core issues. Palestinian statehood and the nature of its sovereignty, the delineation of borders between the two states, the future of Jerusalem, which both sides claim as their own capital, the Palestinian refugees and their rights, the physical link between the 2 Palestinian territories of West Bank and Gaza with Israel in between, the nature of economic relations between the 2 states where one side is wealthy and one side is poor, and the question of natural resources, mostly water. Today, I would add an 8th issue as a separate core issue, and that would be security relations. Every single Palestinian I met with agreed with me on what I wrote. And without being an expert in conflict resolution at that time, I intuitively understood that the first step in resolving a conflict is agreeing what you're fighting about. And I found total agreement. So it seemed to me natural that the next step that we have to do is figure out how to do it. And I proposed 2 really radical things. I said, let's create a joint Israeli-Palestinian institution. This was non-existent, not heard of. Everyone who I presented to said, it's too early, we can't do it now. When someone tells me on an idea that it's too early, I know it's the right thing. And the second thing that I proposed that was really radical is that we're not going to argue about the solution. The solution is 2 states for 2 people based on the 1967 borders. Now we're going to take every single issue in conflict and work backwards, do a kind of reverse engineering, figure out how to do it. And the minute that we propose to put people around the table, experts, and work on Jerusalem, and work on security, and work on water, and work on economic relations, and trade relations, and tourism, and inequities, and agriculture, and you name it, we found serious people on both sides. From the center of the society, it was essential for me, in my understanding of the work that we're doing, that the Israelis who participate in this exercise have to be loyal, Israeli, patriotic citizens. And the Palestinians who participate have to be loyal, patriotic, Palestinian citizens. Each one loyal and patriotic to their own side, because the solutions that they're going to propose have to be accepted by decision makers. And the more that we can engage people from the center of the society, from the establishment, from the decision makers themselves in this circle of decision making, the faster we will arrive at solutions. In fact, in this process we invented, there's track 1, which are formal negotiations. There's track 2 that are informal negotiations. We created something we call track 1.5, which was informal negotiations that involved formal negotiators as well. And we convinced the government of Israel, the governments of Israel over the years, and the leadership of the PLO to include their officials in these working groups. And over 24 years that I did this work, we convened more than 2,000 working groups of Israeli and Palestinian professionals. And before I tell you what I think about the resolution for the conflict, I want to go back to 1988. A year after the Intifada began, Yasser Arafat convened in Algiers a meeting of the PNC, the Palestinian National Council. This is the representative body of the Palestinian people in Palestine and in the diaspora. And at that meeting on November 15th, 1988, Yasser Arafat read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Palestine. This document was drafted by the Palestinian national poet Mahmoud Darwish. Mahmoud Darwish grew up in Israel. He had been an Israeli citizen. He went to school in an Israeli state school for Arab students. He was a refugee from his own village. He was forced to leave with his family his village, and he lived in another village. And as a student in an Israeli state school, he had studied the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of the State of Israel, drafted mainly by David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, is a brilliant document It's really worth reading. Ben-Gurion and his companions wrote this document paragraph by paragraph, justifying why the Jewish people have a right to a state of their own. And he begins that the Jewish people were born in the land of Israel. It was in that land that their identity was shaped, and they gave their identity to the land. And he talked about the history of the Jewish kings and the prophets, and went on to talk about persecution and dispersion, and the first temple and the second temple, and being exiled from our land, and talked about the Holocaust, and concludes the section on the rights of the Jewish people to a state of their own by quoting the UN resolution from November 29th, 1947, UN Resolution 181, which decided to partition the land and enable the Jews to create a state of their own in the land of Israel. When Mahmoud Darwish was asked by Yasser Arafat to write the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, the first thing he did was take out the Israeli Declaration of Independence and read it. He's fluent in Hebrew. And when he started drafting the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, paragraph by paragraph, he wrote why the Palestinian people have a legitimate right to a state of their own. And he started by saying in the land of Palestine, the Palestinian people were born. And it was there that they created their identity and gave their identity to the land. And talked about the hundreds of years and decades of generations of Palestinians who grew up on this land and nurtured the land, and the land nurtured them. And the persecution that came against them with the birth of the Zionist movement, and the Nakba in 1948, which turned them into a people, refugees in their own homeland. And Mahmoud Darwish concludes this section by quoting UN Resolution 181, the partition plan. But Mahmoud Darwish doesn't only talk about the fact that the UN decided to create a Jewish state in Palestine. He says that the UN decided to create two states in Palestine, a Jewish state and an Arab state. He adds that although we rejected that resolution in 1947 because we thought it was unjust that the international community was giving away half of our land, it is by virtue of that international legitimacy that we claim our right to a state today. And in a political statement that was adopted by the Palestinian National Council after reading the Declaration of Independence, the Palestinian people decided that their goal was to create a state of Palestine on 22% of the land between the river and the sea. The territories that Israel occupied in June of 1967, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And since 1988, the Palestinian position in negotiations with Israel has been a two-state solution between the river and the sea, with Israel on 78% of the land and Palestine on 22% of the land. That has been their negotiating position from day one. If you read the resolution that was submitted and drafted by Jordan to the Security Council in December of last year, it is a restatement of the Palestinian position that peace between Israel and Palestine is based on the June 67 borders, with Palestine on 22% of the land and Israel on 78% of the land. That's what it's about. And when the Palestinians made this decision, from their perspective, from their own narrative, they made a concession on 78% of their claim, which in my view made the two-state solution possible. If we think back to 1947, when the UN passed this partition resolution, 2 years after the end of the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews had been killed, the Jews in Palestine danced in the streets that they were given a piece of land of their own. And they knew that the very next morning, 5 Arab armies were going to attack them and threaten their very existence, and yet the Jews went out to the street to dance. I look back to 1988, November 15th, 1988, which is Palestinian Independence Day, and I say, on that day, we should have gone out to the street to dance. Because the Palestinians recognized Israel on 78% of the land. That decision led to the Oslo peace process. We know that on September 13th, 1993, Israel, the government of Israel led by Yitzhak Rabin, and the PLO led by Yasser Arafat, signed the Declaration of Principles for Peace and opened up a new chapter in our history. 22 years later, 6 agreements were signed between Israel and Palestine, And we can only look back and say honestly that this is a failed peace process. Thousands of people have died since we began. There is no peace. There was never peace. Oslo was not a peace treaty. We never concluded a peace treaty. We signed agreements that were the menu of how to get to peace, the roadmap for peace. It was a naive process. Perhaps there was no way of doing it back then except by being naive. The process was based on the idea that these two people who have been battling and killing each other for 100 years need to know each other better. So let's start to work together. Israel will begin to withdraw from territory and turn it over to the Palestinians. They would create a Palestinian self-governing authority taking control of land that Israel would withdraw from. And in exchange for this, the Palestinians would engage in counterterrorism. They would create a robust security force, and they would fight against their own people who were dedicated to destroying Israel. Even though most had left the idea of terrorism and destroying Israel, there was still a significant minority that didn't accept the peace process. And the exchange that the Israelis and the Palestinians made, the rationale was Israel is withdrawing from territory, the Palestinians are taking over that territory, and they would fight terrorism from the territories they take over. But the process went down. Violence continued on both sides, retaliation and responses and revenge. A terrorist attack committed by a Jew who went into the mosque in Hebron, the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in the Ibrahimiyya Mosque, the chamber where Abraham is buried, a Jewish doctor, settler from Hebron, a former American religious person, took his M16 rifle and opened up fire and killed 19 people who were praying and wounded dozens of others. This was unimaginable. Our prime minister was assassinated by a Jew who opposed the peace process. This was unimaginable. Palestinian violence continued into the peace process. Hamas, a political Islamic fundamentalist movement, rose in opposition to the Oslo peace process and challenged the leadership of the PLO and continued to use what they call mukawama, resistance, which we call terrorism. The process went sour. Instead of building trust through the 28 joint bodies that were created through Oslo, a joint economic forum and a joint water committee and a joint tourism committee and a joint veterinary committee and a joint phytosanitary committee and a joint security committee, 26 joint committees that were created to create this trust and to enable us to negotiate those core issues that I talked about at the beginning, disbanded. And instead of creating trust, we created mistrust. And if there's anyone who ever negotiated anything in your lives, you know that when you enter into negotiation where there's no trust, it's not so simple, but you can arrive at an agreement if there are mutual interest. When you're sitting down at a table and you're not at zero trust, but you're at mistrust, you think that the person sitting across from you has no intention to implement what they obligate themselves to do. In fact, you know that they're planning to do the exact opposite. It is then impossible to reach a negotiated agreement. We made lots of mistakes. The agreements were naive. We can't afford naivete. We thought that things would happen that didn't happen, and they went the other way, and it became more and more difficult to negotiate, and 22 years later it seems almost impossible. But we know what went wrong, and we know what the lessons are from doing it wrong, and perhaps the fact that there's mistrust today enables us to make a much better agreement, because an agreement made out of mistrust is going to be a lot more of a careful agreement, an intelligent agreement. I'll tell you what I mean. Any lawyers in the room? I bet you there are a few. Few lawyers? Only one? Well, you've all signed contracts. You know that the final clause of every contract is the breach clause. It tells you what to do when the contract is not implemented. What do you do when there's a breach? Well, the 6 Oslo agreements had a breach clause that was copy and paste and non-implementable. It said, if there's a breach, we negotiate. If we fail to negotiate, we conciliate, mediate. If we fail to mediate, we arbitrate. None of those terms were defined. None of them were operational. How long do we negotiate? Who negotiates? When do we decide to go to mediation? Who's the mediator? What are the rules of mediation? What if we don't like the mediated solution? Do you think that under these circumstances, Israel and Palestine are going to be able to agree on an arbitrator, on one person who's going to be a judge without the right of appeal? So this breach clause was non-implementable. Not only that, we lacked a dispute resolution mechanism. Every time there was a dispute, it ended up on the desk of the Oval Office. Can you imagine the first dispute that arose after Yasser Arafat came back to Palestine? Israel had agreed that 25 Palestinian officials would have a special status, a special VIP status. They would be able to cross into Israel's borders through checkpoints without being stopped or checked. Their personal body and their belongings and their car. And the Minister of Education from the Palestinian Authority drove through an Israeli checkpoint into Jerusalem, going for a meeting in Jerusalem, and he was stopped at the checkpoint by an Israeli sergeant, a kid 19 or 20 years old, who obviously no one told him about this rule about the VIPs, and he ordered the Palestinian minister to get out of his car. He ordered him to take off his jacket, to take off his shirt, to open his pants, to check his briefcase, to check his car, and this guy was humiliated in front of his people, a leader of his people, and in breach of the agreement. And because there was no dispute resolution to deal with it, it ended up on the desk of President Clinton. Can you imagine something so ridiculous? That's symbolic of what happened in this peace process. Tell you another esoteric story that's so significant of what happened in this peace process. When the Israelis and the Palestinians finally got down to negotiate permanent status, which was supposed to happen no later than the third year of the agreement, according to what they signed, it happened only at the end of the fifth year and the beginning of the sixth year at Camp David under President Clinton, in a summit of the leaders that Prime Minister Barak demanded take place, because he was already running a minority government. Clinton was toward the end of his administration and was afraid that the only legacy he would have is Monica Lewinsky, and thought that he could charm the players into making peace. And Yasser Arafat, who said this is a bad idea, we can't resolve a conflict of 100 years in 2 weeks, but was forced into doing it. 2 weeks they spent at Camp David. Ehud Barak at the end of the day refused to participate because Clinton demanded that there be an American note taker in every room. And Barak said there's no agreement until there's a full agreement, and he didn't want to be held responsible for concessions that Israel might make without having a full agreement. And Clinton refused to have any discussions take place at Camp David without an American note taker, because he told both Arafat and Barak, I know you people, you negotiate something, you agree on something, then you leave the room and disagree. So there's going to be an American record of what takes place here. Camp David broke down. There were huge gaps. The Israelis made an offer. It was far short of anything that the Palestinians could accept. 89% of the West Bank, 2 east-west corridors through the West Bank under full Israeli control, an Israeli security envelope around the external borders of the Palestinian state that the Palestinians called a sovereign cage, a Palestinian capital outside of Jerusalem in the town of Abu Dis, which is outside the Jerusalem municipal borders, and in the 2 weeks of Camp David, only 6 hours on refugees took place, where the sides just began to present their positions. So Camp David exploded. There were American bridging proposals prepared at Camp David. And our friend Dennis Ross convinced President Clinton not to give the American bridging proposals at Camp David because they didn't want to put pressure on Barak, who was going home to an angry electorate, which he lost the elections later in a landslide victory by Ariel Sharon. On December 23rd, 2000, 1 month less 3 days before Clinton left office, he called the Israelis and Palestinians to Washington. He sat them in a room and he read to them a document, which you can look up on Google, called the Clinton Parameters, what Clinton thought was necessary to reach a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine based on 2 states. He read the document to the negotiators in the room. He left the room, and Dennis Ross took the document and read it to the negotiators at dictation speed. The Israeli laptop computer's battery died in the middle of the dictation, and the guy took out a piece of paper and started drafting it longhand. When he compared the notes with his Palestinian partner on the other side of the table, they ended up with two different texts. Why didn't they just give them the paper? This is the Middle East. This is so typical of the kind of things that went wrong. Now, had Clinton put down those parameters in July at Camp David, we'd probably be in a very different place today. Because after the failure of Camp David and the explosion of the second Intifada that brought with us a wave of Palestinian suicide bombings inside of Israel, blowing up our cafes and our buses and our people in cinemas, the Israelis and the Palestinians continued negotiations, despite the fact that the Intifada began. The Intifada began on September 28th, 2000. Between July of 2000 and January of 2001, the Israelis and the Palestinians negotiated 52 more times. And then they held another summit in Taba, just over the border in Sinai. And this time they got much closer to an agreement. The Israeli offer went up to 95% of the West Bank, without Israeli control of the external borders and east-west roads, and a Palestinian capital in the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, based on the Clinton parameters. Both sides had accepted the Clinton parameters as the guideline for negotiations in January of 2001. But there was a terrorist attack in Israel. Barak was under enormous pressure. We were 10 days before elections in Israel, and Barak called off the negotiations. The team came home, and then he lost the elections to Ariel Sharon. Sharon was elected, 5 minutes. Sharon was elected telling us that Gaza is as important to him as Tel Aviv. And 2 years later, he decided that Israel is going to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza. Yasser Arafat died. Mahmoud Abbas came to power. Mahmoud Abbas ran for elections on a ticket against the militarization of the Intifada. He said it was wrong to kill Israeli civilians. Terrorism is wrong. We need to engage in a non-violent strategy to achieve our rights, to end the occupation and create a Palestinian state. That was his ticket. That was his campaign. And he won 63% of the votes. And when he created an administration to coordinate the disengagement from Gaza with the Israelis, 9 subcommittees to coordinate taking over Gaza from the Israelis, Ariel Sharon, in Hebrew, called him an efroch marut notzot, a chick without feathers, a real insult, and said he's not a partner. We have no Palestinian partner. And Sharon insisted that we withdraw unilaterally from Gaza, and we bulldozed 23 settlements of Israelis who were living there, and left them in rubble, and left Gaza, locked the gate, tossed over the key to the other side. And who picked up the key? Hamas. Was Mahmoud Abbas, President Abbas, able to claim victory through negotiations and diplomacy? No. Who claimed victory? The Muqawma, the resistance, Hamas. We kicked Israel out of Gaza. The Israelis only understand the language of violence. Only when they force them do they move. And they held elections, and surprise, surprise, Hamas won those elections. Not because Palestinians are radical, fundamentalist, crazy Muslims. I would estimate that somewhere around 10% of Palestinians believe in the ideology of Hamas. But there was a protest vote against Arafat, against corruption, against the failures of the Palestinian leadership to deliver the end of the occupation in the Palestinian state. I know Palestinian Christians who voted Hamas, and they certainly don't believe in the ideology of Hamas. But it was a protest vote, and Hamas won those elections. Fair, free, democratic elections. And Israel, of course, refused to recognize the government of Hamas. Why should they? Hamas is committed to the destruction of Israel. And the international community refused to recognize the government of Hamas. So here we are, all these years later. Hamas has ruled Gaza for 8 years. The Palestinian house is divided. We had another prime minister who attempted to negotiate with the Palestinians in very successful negotiations, Olmert and Abu Mazen. 42 times they met, came very close to reaching an agreement. But Olmert got indicted for corruption. And Condoleezza Rice told the Palestinians to wait for our foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, who will become prime minister. Only she didn't. And here we are, with no negotiations. Netanyahu was just re-elected with a big victory. Why did Netanyahu win? It wasn't expected. But it's very clear, if you understand the Israeli mentality. The opposition, the Labor Party, what they called the Zionist Union, thought that the issue was going to be economics. Economics, stupid. The cost of living, the cost of housing. But that wasn't it. Israelis live in fear. We have a very dangerous neighborhood. We have 100,000 rockets pointed at us from Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have tens of thousands of rockets pointed at us from Hamas in Gaza, and tunnels that they dug to enter Israel and attack Israeli kibbutzim on the border. We have a non-state with ISIS, Daesh attacking in Syria. Who knows what's going to happen in Iraq? A nuclear program in Iran pointed at Israel. Israelis live in fear, and Netanyahu knows how to exploit that. 2 days before elections, he announced that there would be no Palestinian state on my watch. And on election day, he called out to the Israeli public and said, the Arabs are voting in masses, and the leftist organizations are busing them into the polling places. What didn't change in Israel as a result of the elections is the left-right divide. There's still the same difference between left and right in Israel with a large center that existed prior to these elections. What is different is that Netanyahu got a quarter of the votes and made him the clear front runner and the next prime minister, and now he's negotiating a government. But the issue of Palestinian-Israeli peace was not determined by this election. Netanyahu took votes away from the further right political parties, not from the center or from the left. And Israeli society is very divided. And the tragedy of our situation is through the failure of the peace process and the return to violence over these years, we still have a majority of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians who want peace. In fact, to be honest, I don't know a single Israeli nor a single Palestinian who doesn't want peace. And somewhere between 60 to 70% of Israelis and 60 to 70% of Palestinians, it's a mirror image of public opinion, say that when you tell us what this peace package looks like and we describe it, 60 to 70% of Israelis and Palestinians say, I can accept that. But we have a larger majority, between 70 and 80% of Israelis and Palestinians, who say it's not possible. And why do they say it's not possible? We have no partner on the other side. It is tragic. I cross these borders every day. I travel all around Israel. I speak to Israelis from all walks of life. I travel all over Palestine. I speak to Palestinians from all walks of life in refugee camps, in towns and cities and villages. I go all over and I meet people every single day. And I hear the same thing from both sides. We're stuck. We're really stuck. Because we know that if each side believed there was a partner for peace on the other side, they would be willing to make the concessions necessary to arrive at a peace treaty. We're stuck because every time the Americans have intervened in the negotiating process, they have screwed it up so badly, they've made it much worse for the next time we want to negotiate. The two best sets of negotiations that ever took place between Israel and Palestine were the negotiations in Oslo, where the Americans were absent. They didn't even know the talks were going on. The Norwegians stood outside the door and served smoked salmon and gave nice drinks and offered their assistance, and when it was needed, and it was, they came in with very concrete, fair, even-handed proposals to bridge the gaps. And the negotiations between Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas, where they met 42 times without an American sitting in the room. When John Kerry launched his 9-month process of negotiations, it was very clear that it was going to be a failure. We know from experience when there's an American in the room, the Israeli talks to the Americans, the Palestinians talk to the Americans, and the Israelis and the Palestinians don't talk to each other. That's the dynamic. And even when Martin Indyk, Ambassador Indyk, who's an expert in the field, two-time American ambassador to Israel, head of policy planning of the State Department, the vice president of the Brookings Institute, this man knows his stuff. He left the room to enable the Israeli and the Palestinian negotiators to be there without him. And they waited for him to come back. This is not going to be resolved by a Pax Americana. There is no imposed solution. It is only going to happen when the Israelis and the Palestinians decide to make it happen. What is happening on the ground, with this I'll conclude and we'll open up for discussion. It should be very clear. We will have a right-wing government in Israel, most likely. The government of Israel will continue to build settlements in the territories it occupied in 1967 against the will of almost the entire international community. The Palestinians have adopted a diplomatic, non-violent strategy, and they are on the path to victory. They have gained the recognition of 153 countries in the State of Israel. They no longer call themselves the Palestinian Authority. They sit in the UN as a non-member state recognized by the United Nations under the name the State of Palestine. On every Palestinian government building in the West Bank, it no longer says the Palestinian National Authority, it says Dawlat Palestine, the State of Palestine. They are about to submit once again through the French a resolution to the United Nations Security Council, which will put down in the Security Council parameters for peace, which will be a reiteration of the Clinton parameters and a timeline for Israel ending its occupation. They have gone to the International Criminal Court, where they are challenging Israel mainly on the issue of the legality of settlements. And they are calling on the international community to impose pressure on the State of Israel. It is very unlikely that the economic pressure will have a real impact on Israel, but it will. What will have a bigger impact on Israel is the psyche of Israelis, who have a craving, perhaps a neurotic, perhaps a psychotic craving because of our history, to be legitimate, to be liked, to be accepted. This is who we are as a people. We have a real need for it because of our history. And Israelis are traveling around the world today and feeling less and less welcome wherever they go. And there will be boycotts. There already are. There are companies that have withdrawn from contracts in Israel. And there are pension funds in Europe which have withdrawn its investments from Israel. And this trend will continue, and the pressure will mount. There's a petition in FIFA. You all know what FIFA is? The Football Federation Soccer, to withdraw the rights of the Israeli team to play in FIFA. That will have a bigger impact than any economic sanction on the people of Israel. If Israel's not allowed to compete in the World Cup, even though they lose every time, that we won't be there, that'll have an impact. And this is what's happening. And the Palestinians are on a winning strategy on the condition that they don't return to violence. And it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to keep their people reined in, and with people there who want to continue to kill Israelis. But they're on this path to victory, and the people of Israel are going to have to come to terms with the reality that, as I see it, the game is over. Israel can no longer be a Jewish nation state and a democratic state and continue to occupy the Palestinian people and deny them their rights for liberation and self-determination. The game is over. Whether you recognize the existence of a Palestinian people or not, or think they're legitimate or not, the game is over. The world has decided that this conflict must come to an end. The parameters for peace are a Palestinian state on the basis of the June 4th, 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as a shared, open city capital for two states. There are solutions for every issue in conflict. Every single issue here is resolvable. We know how to do it. The experts have done it. The negotiators have done it. There are draft agreements on the table. There have been secret negotiations that have been taking place between Israeli and Palestinian leaders for years, even up to 3 weeks before the elections. And agreements are possible. We need leadership to do it, that we don't have at this moment. I believe that the Palestinian leader is ripe, is a partner for peace, Mahmoud Abbas. He has to deal with the divided house. But he says, give me an agreement that includes Gaza as part of the Palestinian state, and write in the agreement that it will not be implemented in Gaza until the regime that controls Gaza accepts the terms of the agreement, and one of the terms of the agreement is that Palestine will be a demilitarized state. And then 1.8 million Palestinians who live in Gaza will look around at themselves and their leaders and say, we refuse not to be part of this deal. We refuse to continue to live in poverty and squalor and siege without rights of movement and life. Young people have no hopes for any future in Gaza. And they will either overthrow the Hamas government, or they will call on their Arab brothers and sisters around the Arab countries to help them to do it. But with a real opportunity for peace and prosperity on the table, Hamas will no longer be able to govern. And if it doesn't happen, the status quo continues. In the absence of the leadership to drive us forward, I've always believed in a top-down approach. I really think that these things need to be negotiated at the top level. But I think that the Palestinian strategy of gaining international support in the Security Council resolution, which has the chance for the first time of not facing an American veto, because of the conflict between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, might actually lead the United States to do what it believes and either abstain or vote for the resolution that would give sustenance to the two-state solution. I call it saving Israel from itself. Because I believe in Israel. And I believe that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And I believe that Israel has a right to exist. But Israel can no longer exist and deny the Palestinian people those same rights. We can't do it. It's not right. It's not democratic. It's not Jewish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gershon. That was an amazing speech, presentation. We're going to do it slightly differently today since we have such a private gathering. We're actually going to have the microphone go around. People can ask direct questions. And please, questions, not statements. I will start.
It's okay with me if you want to make a statement and object to what I said, or support what I said, but put a period at the end of it.
I will start with a question before we pass on. This view that we just heard, we tend to hear that in Europe quite a bit. The position in Europe tends to be very different. In fact, it's a view that I've read in Israeli newspapers quite often. And in fact, I often resort to the Israeli newspapers for clarity and a more, what shall I say, sort of a balanced view. Yet we don't tend to see it in the American media so much. Why do you think that is?
I think that the American Jewish community is deeply troubled by what's going on in Israel. American Jewish establishment, which is very organized, is often organized around money and not necessarily ideas. And the position of the American Jewish community historically has been to support Israel whatever it does, for the fear of anti-Semitism, for the fear that criticism of Israel might actually be the delegitimation of Israel, which is modern anti-Semitism. And there's a fear that any cracks in the wall of the American Jewish community would create divisions and cause the American Jewish community to weaken its impact and its power in American politics. So it's become very difficult within the American Jewish community to have an open discussion about Israel. I go around this country and I lecture in synagogues and Jewish organizations. I just came from 2 liberal arts colleges with large Jewish populations. What I find around this country, particularly amongst young people, amongst young Jews, is that the majority of them don't want to hear about Israel at all. And this for me is very sad. The majority of young Jews in America today, and I think this is documented in statistics, say Israel, I don't want to hear about it. They're not engaged, they're not part of the organized Jewish community. They're seeking alternatives. The alternative to the establishment Jewish lobby, the AIPAC, the American Israel Public Action Committee, is the formation of another group called J Street, which is an alternative lobby that describes itself as pro-Israel and pro-peace, are finding great residence on campuses around the country. In J Street U, the J Street University chapters are growing. But still, a majority of Jews today are not members of AIPAC, nor are they members of J Street. They're just not affiliated. And this, I think, is a challenge to American Jewish establishment, to worry about the community dissociating itself from Israel. We have an additional problem, which is a problem that goes beyond the Jewish community and affects American democracy as well as Israeli democracy. Our number one newspaper today in Israel is a newspaper called Israel Today, Israel Hayom. It is a freebie, and it's become the number one newspaper in Israel, read by more Israelis in large numbers than any other newspaper. It is a newspaper that's owned by Sheldon Adelson. In Hebrew, the word newspaper is iton. And you know Netanyahu's nickname is Bibi. We call this the Bibi tone. And the Bibi tone, Israel Hayom, has changed Israel's media. It has destroyed newspapers that have existed for decades. And it has changed public opinion, because when you read a political newspaper every single day and get beat over the head every single day, you end up agreeing with what you read. You know that Sheldon Adelson plans to put $1 billion into the election campaign, together with the Koch brothers, who will add another $1 billion to this campaign. And here we get into a much larger question on how do democracies remain democracies when people with money and means and particular political opinions want to shape political decision-making in this country or in my country through the use of their money. And in the case of Sheldon Adelson, it's Jewish money. It's very much identified with a particular position on Israel. And one of the really difficult things that I think Israel is going to face in the coming years is a direct outcome of both Sheldon Adelson, Netanyahu, and the disagreement with Obama, particularly on Iran, is that for the first time since Israel's existence, Israel is becoming a partisan issue. Israel was always a bipartisan issue that had support on both sides of the House, Democrats and Republicans. And now Israel is becoming partisan, which I think is bad for Israel. I think it's bad for American Jewry, and I think it's an indication of something wrong in the American democracy as well. And it's a concern that I think we should all be concerned with, about how do democracies survive when these situations emerge.
I was wondering if you could comment.
Can you just tell me your name?
Hugh Idstein.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if you could comment specifically on settlements, how Israel justifies them, and its impact on the peace process.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand what the whole settlement thing is about from the Israeli Jewish perspective. 3 weeks prior to the 6 Days War that started on June 5th, 1967, President Nasser of Egypt, in an alliance with the Syrians, formed a joint army command and ordered UN peacekeeping troops that had been placed in Sinai in 1956, ordered them out of Sinai and closed the Straits of Tiran, which were the waters, the international waters that Israel's shipping went to Africa and Asia, and started threatening to destroy Israel. And for a 3-week period, through May until the beginning of June, the atmosphere in Israel was one of another Holocaust is impending. This was real. If you go back and read the newspapers of the day, you will see how Israelis were talking about that this is the end of the Jewish Republic. This is the end of it. It's going to end. The Arab army is going to march across the land of Israel. And in a brilliant preemptive strike on June 5th, early in the morning, the Israeli Air Force wiped out the Air Force of Egypt and Syria, and in 6 days conquered the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights of Syria, and the Sinai Desert of Egypt. This was nothing short of a miracle. And if you were a religious Israeli or a person with religious tendencies, this was perceived as a direct message from God. We in Judaism have 613 commandments in our Torah. About 1/3 of those commandments deal directly with the land of Israel. And when we open our Torah and read the portions of the Torah every week in synagogue, We read the stories of the prophets that took place on the hilltops and the valleys of Judea and Samaria, and not on the beaches of Tel Aviv. Judea and Samaria is the West Bank. So if you're a believing person, and you think this miracle of 6 days was a message from God, then you seek to implement those commandments related to the land of Israel, which are directly engaging in settling the land. And people opened up their Old Testaments and they went back to the places that are mentioned in the Old Testament, Shiloh and Kedumim and Beit El and Ophrah, and on those very places mentioned in the Old Testament created settlements. And they created an organization called the Block of the Faithful. And with this, they believed that they were bringing redemption. The Messiah would come by us settling the land of Israel. There was a whole other group of people without this whole religious messianic fervor who said this is a security issue. The West Bank has a mountain ridge that goes through it. Whoever controls the mountain ridge controls the coastal plain of Israel where 90% of Israelis live. We need to control the coastal hills, the hills to control the coastal plain, and they went and built settlements there. And this is the story of the settlements. There were also people from the right wing after Begin was elected in '77 who said that the surest way to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state, which is a mortal danger to Israel, is by building settlements. And Yitzhak Shamir, one of our prime ministers, said, we will negotiate with the Palestinians for 20 years and move 500,000 Israelis into the territories. And in fact, that's what happened. One of the oversights in Oslo, in the 6 agreements that we signed, is that it says nowhere in those agreements that Israel can't build settlements. It was never mentioned. It was unimaginable that Israel was going to build settlements in areas that they were expected to withdraw from to create the Palestinian state. It was an oversight. Now, from a wider perspective, the international community, the Palestinians, building settlements is illegal by international law. The 4th Geneva Conventions, which governed territories occupied in a belligerent occupation, that's what it's called, says explicitly that an occupying power does not have the right to transfer its citizens into the territories it occupied. We could build military bases there. We could have hundreds of thousands of soldiers there. That's not illegal. The minute you transfer civilians there, that's illegal by international law. There are Israelis and some international lawyers who would argue that it doesn't apply because it wasn't a belligerent occupation. Israel was attacked and defended itself. Doesn't matter, according to the 4th Geneva Convention. Who started? The end result of the war is that the territories were occupied in a belligerent occupation. And there are those who claim that it's not valid because there was no legal sovereign there. Jordan had annexed those territories illegally. There were only 2 countries in the world that recognized the annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem by Jordan, Pakistan and Britain. The whole rest of the world didn't recognize it. It doesn't matter. According to international law, these are illegal. And Israel has enjoyed impunity with regard to the illegal settlements since 1967. And the international community is now saying enough.
I would just like to say we're conscious that time is up, but this is also a discussion that people are obviously interested in. So those of you who would like to stay and keep asking questions, please do. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us.
Dennis Ross, on one occasion here in Houston, made reference to a conversation, a personal conversation that he had with Yasser Arafat.
Put the mic closer.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Dennis Ross made reference to a conversation he had personally had with Yasser Arafat in the immediate aftermath of the death of the Prime Minister of Israel. And Dennis Ross asked him, Mr. Chairman, why can't we just stop shooting and have peace? And Yasser Arafat had a very interesting answer. He says, you must understand that I have been appointed to be the representative of the Palestinian people. And he went on and commented, and Dennis Ross's impression from that conversation was that he was not elected to be a negotiator. He was elected to be an advocate for the Palestinian people and their political objectives. Now, Dr. Hirschfeld was in Houston, also at the Baker Institute, and he confirmed that that was also his conclusion, that the mistake that we made in the whole peace process is doing it from the top down rather than from the ground up. Because what we have now is a Palestinian Authority that was appointed by international interest in Europe and North America, and was not elected by the Palestinian people. I'd like to get your comments on that.
Okay, it's an interesting comment. I'm familiar with it. I would say that one of the tragic failings of Yasser Arafat was that he failed to make the transition from revolutionary leader to statesman. This was his biggest failing of anything else. When I was serving as an advisor to this team of intelligence officers that Rabin had made to advise him on the peace process, I had suggested that Rabin notify Yasser Arafat as president of Palestine, as he called himself, that if he wanted to meet with the Prime Minister of Israel, he should wear a business suit and take off his army uniform. And that if he wants to meet with the generals, that's fine, he can wear his army uniform, but if he's going to be a statesman, he should dress like a statesman. Rabin was rather shy and bashful and thought it was improper for him to tell Yasser Arafat how to dress. I thought it was symbolic, and I thought it was meaningful, and even though it was perhaps wrong to tell some other leader how they should dress, I think it was significant of the fact that Arafat didn't make that transition to be statesman. Mahmoud Abbas was elected by the people. It's true he was elected a long time ago. And it's true that he doesn't have legitimacy on the streets of Palestine today. But his lack of legitimacy is not only because he was elected so long ago, it's because he's failed to deliver on the promise. And he promised that through diplomacy and through negotiations, he would bring about the end of the Israeli occupation and Palestinian statehood. And he's failed to deliver. If tomorrow he were to bring an agreement that would end the occupation and bring them statehood, he would be the most celebrated leader in the Arab world, including in Palestine. That's not the case. There needs to be new elections in Palestine. They need to elect a new leadership, even without elections on the immediate horizon. And the main reason is because the House is divided, and they don't want to have elections just in the West Bank. They want to have it for West Bank and Gaza, but Hamas doesn't agree to that now. Even with that situation, there is no real challenging the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. People say we don't like him, we want him to go, we want new elections. But there's no one out there who's saying he has to go now and I'm going to make him go. So he is still respected, he is still ruling, he is still engaging in security cooperation with Israel, meaning fighting counterterrorism. There's 700 to 800 Palestinians from Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestinian Authority prisons. There is no doubt in my mind that there has to be a top-down process. You don't have political agreements between states without a top-down process, but you're right, we need a very strong bottom-up process as well. And in the absence of the ability to have a top-down process today, I'm putting my emphasis on the bottom-up process. I called in my weekly column in the Jerusalem Post 2 weeks ago for a new strategy that I've been talking about recently a lot. I want people to do what I did. We live in a world with lots of borders and barriers, concrete walls, barbed wire fences, and illegal traveling. Israelis can't go to Palestine, it's illegal. Palestinians can't come into Israel without a permit from the Israeli military. We can't meet. I have 2 telephones, my Israeli phone and my Palestinian phone. You know why? My Israeli phone, I have a great deal. $17 I pay a month. Unlimited calls, unlimited text, unlimited internet. I can call 26 countries for free, including the United States. I talked to my father in Florida for free. The most expensive call in the world for me to make is Palestine. So I got, in my old BlackBerry, I put a Palestinian SIM in it, and I call Palestine on a Palestinian phone, because it's much cheaper. They don't want us to talk to each other. But in the 21st century, we live in a borderless cyber world. And every single Israeli and every single Palestinian is online and connected. And we all have Facebook. And I'm telling Israelis and Palestinians, open up your Facebook, find someone on the other side, knock on their door and say, hey, I want to listen to you. I want to understand you. Don't challenge them, don't debate them, don't score points. Say to them, I want to listen to you. In my life experience, I have never met a person who, when you say, I want to listen to you, I want to understand you, who says, no, I won't talk to you. My rule of thumb is I talk to anyone who's willing to talk to me. And I usually start by asking to listen. Believe me, I get my points in there. But when you start to listen, you open up doors to communication. People say, how am I going to find someone? I tell them, go to your Facebook, write Mahmoud. You'll find a Palestinian. Write Fatma, you'll find a Palestinian. And if you have trouble, come to my Facebook page. I got 5,000 friends and 7,500 followers, and half of them are Palestinians. Pick one of them. Start talking. That's what we need to do from the bottom up. And of course, business. Business we need to do together. I've been working the past 2.5 years in trying to create a Palestinian solar energy business. We're about to get 2 licenses next week after 2 years of going through the regulatory frameworks of Palestine, to get 2 licenses for solar energy projects, and we're bringing in investors from around the world to begin to create independent energy for an independent Palestine, because we know that in the energy business, in infrastructure business, when you do a successful commercial venture with a long-term contract that's backed by governments and banks, it's a magnet for investment. And an economy of Israel with $36,000 per capita, and the economy of Palestine with $1,800 per capita is not sustainable. We as Israelis have an interest that our neighbors are prosperous and happy, and we should do everything possible to help them to get there. It's in our interest that we have wealthy, happy neighbors. So this is another example of how we can do things from the bottom up, and everyone can make money from it and be happy about it and benefit each other.
My name is George Shamia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, speak a little louder.
My name is George Shamia. I'm from Ramallah.
أهلا وسهلا.
ففيك. وبعدين I wanted to ask you, if Hamas, the leadership of Hamas, were to edit out of their charter of the destruction of the state of Israel, do you think that would be easier for Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah and Hamas to form a coalition government, a unity government? And if that's the case, do you feel like Israel can negotiate with Palestinians?
Yeah, if Hamas were to remove those things from its charter, it would no longer be Hamas. And the issue would be completely benign about negotiating. It would be just an election of any Palestinian being legitimate in terms of Israel and the international community. I don't think it's possible. My experience, I'm the Israeli who spent more time talking to Hamas people than anyone else in the world except Gilad Shalit, who was in captivity for 5 years and 4 months, and with the exception of Israeli prisoner officers who talked to Palestinians from Hamas in prison, which is a very different conversation. There are 2 people in the Hamas movement who I would call moderates, only 2. There are many people in Hamas who I would call pragmatic, which is different than being a moderate. They have to be pragmatic because 1.8 million people live in Gaza who are totally dependent on Israel for water, electricity, food, everything, medicine, everything. So they have to be pragmatic. They've developed systems of third parties, intermediaries, usually people from Fatah who stand at the border or do the business with Israelis so that they won't talk to Israelis, but they won't have any direct contact with Israel. And they're dedicated to the destruction of Israel. The myth is, I asked one of the Hamas ideologues once, this was an interesting conversation, I asked him, is your opposition to Israel because according to Islam, Palestine is a waqf, is a Muslim trust? And he laughed at me and he said, Gershon, I'm surprised at you. For us Muslims, the whole world is a waqf, not Palestine. Our objection to Israel is political. We don't believe that the Jewish people have a right to a state. We don't believe they're a people, they're a religion. And they came and they took our land. That was his answer. And I don't think that you have people in Hamas who are ready to take that out of their charter. I wish there was. As I said, I know 2 people who I think would. Maybe if circumstances changed and there was a little more willingness from Israel to reach out, maybe there would be some response in return. I doubt it. But I don't think it's possible. And I think when they did make a national reconciliation government, it was possible because Hamas agreed to all the terms of and conditions of Mahmoud Abbas. They agreed to have a government without any representation. They agreed that Abbas could continue to negotiate with Israel. They agreed that Abbas would continue a security cooperation with Israel. And they agreed that Abbas could put his troops back into Gaza. Those things weren't implemented, which is one of the reasons why the government fell apart. It's not functioning. But it was only under those conditions that Abbas was willing to make a national reconciliation government. I don't see those things changing yet, but we should be aware when there's no agreement, there are changes on the ground. There were student elections that were held at Birzeit University yesterday. 51 seats in the student council, Hamas took 25 seats. This is the change. In the last student elections that were held, they had less than a third. Prior to that, they had less than a quarter. Now they took half the seats in the Birzeit, and the indication of what happens in the Palestinian universities in the West Bank is significant of what's happening in the society. It's not because people are becoming fundamentalist Muslims, it's because they're frustrated with the lack of progress, of no negotiations and no ending the occupation and the continuation of the settlement building.
I'm Paul Osofsky, one of the founders of Houston J Street. I have a one-sentence statement. My Old Testament says, "You shall not oppress the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Period.
I agree. Not only that, I would say, and what my revision of the Old Testament statement is that if you're pro-Israel, you have to be pro-Palestine. They go hand in hand.
Since the Yom HaAtzmaut really doesn't mean Independence Day, as I'm sure you know, it's a day for an opportunity to redefine oneself. Given all that you say and see from an Israeli perspective, is this the definition of modern Israeli Jewish philosophy is as far as ever making peace? I didn't say that very clearly. Is this the definition that we're stuck with in the 21st century of an intransigent Israel? And I say that because Israel holds virtually all the cards. Obviously, the Palestinians are partners and they have something to do, but Israel has all the power and all the glory.
I hope not. I don't believe that's the case. I can't, see it clearly in my crystal ball. Both sides are quite intransigent today. Israel more, and Israel holds more of the cards for sure. And I think it as I said, it emanates from the fear that Israelis live in, and the response to fear today is to build higher walls. We asked Israelis, what would convince you that there's a Palestinian partner? Because we knew, they said if there's a partner, we're ready to make concessions. And we did some focus group research amongst Israelis and asked them, what would convince you if there's a Palestinian partner? Their response was two things. One, if they taught peace in the classrooms, they changed their curriculum and taught about the existence of Israel and peace. And if Muslim clergy preached in the mosques peace, that would convince them. For Netanyahu, the main breaking point for him, as he stated in being convinced that the Palestinians were partners, is if they would be willing to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. For Netanyahu and for people in the right wing, it's not enough that Yasser Arafat recognized the existence of the state of Israel and its right to live in defensible borders. They want a recognition of Israel's legitimacy as the nation state of the Jewish people. And until now, the Palestinian response has been that we will never do that, which I think is a bad response. I had advised Mahmoud Abbas that if you can't say, yes, I will recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, you should say, it's none of our business, you define who you are, we recognize you as a state. But nonetheless, this has become a challenge for Arafat. I will tell you that I recently asked for a meeting with Netanyahu because I've had this discussion with Mahmoud Abbas. And I believe that it is possible to arrive at a formula that he would be willing to say yes to recognizing Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, but it would be a conditional yes. It would be an if-then, what we would call in diplomacy a deposit. If I get what I need to get in terms of statehood and sovereignty and borders and recognition, etc., then I'd be willing to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Well, I asked Netanyahu for a meeting because I want him to give me enough leeway to be able to try to convince Mahmoud Abbas to do it. I'm not sure that Netanyahu will agree to meet with me because I'm not sure that he wants Abbas to do it. Because if Abbas answers the challenge, then he has to go into real negotiations, and I'm not sure that that's what he wants to do. We'll see. Again, I don't know if he's going to agree to meet with me. I don't know if I could succeed in this challenge, but if I could, it'll be really interesting to see what plays out.
And if you could good, you need to come back and tell us all
Okay.
about it. I'm conscious it's 2 o'clock. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your visit. I'm sure you'll have questions. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.